Hello, everyone. Let's talk about Epictetus. So, Epictetus was a Stoic philosopher who taught us how we could cultivate inner strength, confidence, and resilience all in the way that we use our minds. I applied his teaching to my life this last month and I found it so incredibly empowering. I'm very excited to share this with you. First, let's talk a little bit more about who Epictetus was. Well, Epictetus was actually born into slavery, and he noticed something very interesting early on. He noticed that the slave owners and the slaves were both imprisoned in entirely different ways. So, the slave owners, for example, some of them were constantly chasing status, power, more wealth. They wanted to get like that nice, powerful position in Congress. And this led them to basically imprison themselves to whoever could help them get there. They were constantly trying to please somebody else, whether it be the emperor or whoever is closest to the emperor. And they basically willingly gave up freedom over their life and let somebody else dictate and tell them what to do. And then on the other hand, you had the slaves, who, of course, wanted to get their own freedom, but the problem was that not all of them had the skills that they needed in order to be able to provide for themselves. And some of them, unfortunately, ended up doing less favorable things in order to just be able to survive. So Epictetus saw that, well, it's not your external conditions of your life or even just anything outside of you that gives you that internal freedom. And so now we're going to get into the three main parts of Epictetus's philosophy that I'd like to summarize here to you today. Well, the first point would be that it's not things outside of us that truly ever bother us, but it's our own internal judgments of those things. The second point would be that we should focus only on the aspects of life that we can control, and we should disregard all other aspects of life. Some things that Epictetus says we can't control are our desires, our aversions, our wills, how we make our decisions. Some things that we could not control is basically anything outside of us. Anything that happens, whether you get exiled or you don't get exiled, your reputation, your social status, your wealth, your health, your body, the people that you love, all of these are things outside of ourselves. And the third concept that I want to discuss today would be amor fati and surrendering to life, and the idea that there's a divine reason to the universe and that there is a structure for everything that happens, even if it supersedes our current understanding. So let's dive deeper into each one of these topics, but I want to start with the last topic first, and then I'm going to go ahead and connect them all. So the Stoics believed in divine reason, that there's a structured, rational order to the universe, even if it supersedes our current understanding, and that we also have the ability to use reason in our own mind, and that's what connects us to the divine. They kind of believe that the gods gave us everything that we needed, so our ability to use reason connects us to the god, to the divine, and our body connects us to other animals. And what they believed our purpose was is to use reason to make the best use of life and also to make the best judgments and actions and live in harmony with nature by accepting everything outside of us that we can't control. So, one of the ways that Epictetus suggests we use this reason in our life day to day is that we start by accepting that we're first wrong. We assume that our internal judgment of what is happening is wrong, and by further questioning ourselves, we could get to the truth. And the reason for this is because, on the other hand, if we always assume that we're right, we would have no reason to question ourselves. For example, would you try to learn something that you already know? Probably not, right? And so instead of letting our life kind of just be a long series of confirmation bias, if we first start by thinking that we're wrong, then we can actually get to the truth. And also, this idea of amor fati and surrendering to life. I really like this because it reminds me of, from the Buddhist perspective, how when we resist life, that's when we create more suffering and more pain for ourselves. But I think also sometimes we naturally resist life. And I think at that moment when we identify that, that would also be a great opportunity to use reason. Like, I know I did this myself, where I recently started learning a new programming language in order to get the goal that I want, right? But I found that when I was sitting down to study, my eyes just kept wandering over to the clock, and I was wondering when I might be ready for my next break. And I have to question myself at that time to understand that, because otherwise, that will control my life. And I find sometimes that it's, those unconscious belief patterns that you have, or even just a fear that you have, maybe that I'm not smart enough or I'm not going to be good at learning this, that makes us want to not learn it. But if we can identify that and then we use reason to question ourselves, we have so much more freedom because we're not holding ourselves back anymore. And then let's tie this in with more fati again. So Epictetus suggests that we just be confident of everything that occurs outside of ourselves and that we should question everything that happens inside of ourselves. The outside world is always to just be accepted, but that we focus our attention on the internal world where we can truly make a change. So now let's get to the second point of focusing only on things that we can control and letting go of everything we can't control. Earlier, I said that some things we can't control would be reputation, social status, wealth, power, our health, and basically anything that's given to us can also be taken away from us. So it kind of becomes something that we can't control. And in order to live a wise life, a happy, peaceful life, it would be suggested that we not focus on those things. Let's just dive into one of these, for example, like reputation. Well, your reputation is an accumulation of individual people's perception of you. That's based off of their own belief systems, their own mind, their own experiences, none of which we know have even been properly investigated. We don't know if people are properly applying reason to their own judgments. That's just our responsibility to do as individuals. But, for example, if you give a homeless man money, then one person will say, "Oh, you're a generous, kind person helping to support someone during a bad day." And then the other person will say, "Well, you're enabling someone to continue making poor decisions." And both of these different perspectives are just based on the individual's own mind. And Epictetus would suggest it's none of our concern. Our concern is what decisions are we making. Our concern is how we use the things that we can control. So everything like status, wealth, they're not to be fought. Whether you are to be wealthy or you're to be poor or you're to be liked or you're to be very disliked, they are what they are. And we should just accept those. So now, how do we effectively use the things that we do control? Well, this is where it gets fun. Epictetus suggests that we can control our desires, our aversions, our will, our judgment, the way that we use our mind. And so, what he says is your will, for example. No one can really force you to do anything, right? You have the power and the ability to decide what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. But somebody could say, well, he kind of forced me into it by dangling this one other thing over me. Or he kind of like twisted my arm. Or maybe he manipulated me. And so now that's where our desires and our aversions become incredibly important. Somebody can only twist your hand and encourage you to do something if you desire something outside of yourself, if you're afraid of something that's outside of yourself. And so, what Epictetus suggests is we minimize our desires, we minimize our aversions. It's to want less from outside of yourselves and to be scared of less from outside of yourselves as well. And where we should focus our aversions and our desires is to our moral character. So, our desire should be that I want to live my life bravely. I want to accept the things that happen outside of me. I want to live with courage. I don't want to let anything scare me. So it's not that rather than fearing exile, for example, somebody should instead fear accepting exile, like screaming and arguing and complaining. That instead, they should desire to accept it with dignity and with grace. So basically, that we should focus our aversions and our desires on our moral character, things that we can control and no one else can take away from us. No one can control the way that you choose to respond to life. But it's important that we get our own desires and aversions in control because they might lead us around otherwise. Now let's discuss our first point. When Epictetus says that it's not things outside of us that truly ever bother us, but it's our own internal impressions of those things. What does this mean? We've talked a little bit about the internal and the external. Well, let's walk through an example. For example, an external condition could be maybe you see somebody wearing a scary mask. Well, what the our judgments do is our judgments give value to those things. We give meaning to things by everything that happens inside of our own brain. So, for example, you could have two people respond to this entirely different. Maybe if one person seen a lot of scary movies, they would feel instantly fear. Their first impression or first judgment of that would be to panic, to think that maybe they're not in a safe condition. And then on the other hand, if you have a person that's grown up in a culture where such face masks are more indicative of a festival, maybe they would, get excited. They would get celebrate. They would look around themselves like, hey guys, hold on, where are the drums and the balloons? Right? And so, what Epictetus does, remember, because we always have to assume that we're wrong and question ourselves, is to ask ourselves in that moment, well, am I really under any risk? Is there really anything for me to be scared of right now? And that by constantly questioning ourselves like this, we can just create more freedom because now we're not staying stuck in one thought pattern. We're using reason to actually get to the truth. Basically, what we're saying here is that it's not things outside of you that produce that negative or that happy, positive emotion inside of you. Those are all things that our impressions, our thoughts, our mind, we give those meaning. And that is incredibly empowering because we've also discussed questioning ourselves, using reason to free ourselves from our initial judgment and get to the truth of what will actually be aligned with nature and be a peaceful life. One last thing to tie everything together is that Epictetus suggests, this is not really from Epictetus, but well, life is an accumulation of different memories. But our memories are so heavily impacted, well, they're basically determined by our internal judgments. And so, just by questioning our internal judgments and the way that we choose to respond to things outside of us, that's all we need to create a happy, beautiful, peaceful life for ourselves. And I'm so happy that I got to summarize these 3 points to you guys. There's so much more about this that I want to talk about, and I'm going to make additional videos on this as well. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to link a Substack essay that I wrote in the description or the comments that also has more information. And I just finished reading Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, and I want to tie all of this together for you, and I want to get into more detail, but I feel this was a good introduction. So please let me know what you think, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.